Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lavender Scare, the Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in the Federal Government, by David K. Johnson, narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Introduction. Panic on the Potomac. In February 1950, two statements by U.S. government officials concerning security risks in the State Department captured national attention. One has come to be seen as a pivotal moment in American history, the Wheeling, West Virginia speech that catapulted Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin, into the national limelight and gave the era its name. In that speech, McCarthy made the inflammatory claim that 205 card-carrying communists were working for the State Department. The other statement, though in part a response to McCarthy's continuing charges about subversives in the State Department, has been all but forgotten. Appearing before a congressional committee, Deputy Undersecretary John Purifoy denied that the department employed any actual communists. At the same time, however, he revealed that a number of persons considered to be security risks had been forced out, and that among these were 91 homosexuals. Rather than see the revelation as evidence of an effective security system, many interpreted it as proof that the State Department, perhaps the entire government, was infiltrated with sexual perverts. Members of Congress demanded to know who hired the 91, whether they found jobs in other government departments, and if there were any more. Seeming to confirm McCarthy's charges about subversives in the State Department, Purifoy's revelation prompted concern and outrage throughout the nation. Heated debates on the floors of Congress, congressional committee investigations, countless newspaper articles, and numerous White House meetings. It eventually led to the ouster of thousands of government employees. It marked the beginning of a Lavender Scare. In 1950, many politicians, journalists, and citizens thought that homosexuals posed more of a threat to national security than communists. One Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist argued, "There is no record of comparable corruption in American history." In a national radio broadcast, liberal Elmer Davis noted, "It looks as if the enemies of the State Department and of the administration generally have gotten hold of a more profitable issue than communism." In one of many debates on the Senate floor that year, Senator Kenneth Wherry, Republican from Nebraska, asked his colleagues, "Can you think of a person who could be more dangerous to the United States of America than a pervert?" Three of President Harry Truman's top advisors wrote him a joint memorandum warning that the country is more concerned about the charges of homosexuals in the government than about communists. Constituents writing to members of Congress confirmed this analysis. Many of them tell me, Representative Claire Hoffman, Republican from Michigan, told his colleagues, they are concerned before they get to the issue of communism or loyalty with this issue of morality and decency. By November, what some journalists derided as the Panic on the Potomac and some politicians defended as the purge of the perverts resulted in the dismissal of nearly 600 federal civil servants. In the State Department alone, security officials boasted that on average they were firing one homosexual per day, more than double the rate for those suspected of political disloyalty. Beyond McCarthy. Despite the concern, even hysteria at the time, and the many people affected, historians of the McCarthy era have given stunningly little attention to the Lavender Scare. Political historians of McCarthyism, anti-communism, and the rise of the national security state emphasize the role of partisan politics and foreign policy and minimize moral and cultural concerns. If they mention the Lavender Scare at all, they portray it as a minor byproduct of the Red Scare, one so seemingly natural and inevitable as to need no explanation. Even the most recent studies of McCarthyism, both defenses from the right and critiques from the left all but ignore how the fears of communists and homosexuals overlapped. In the 1950s, many McCarthy supporters viewed the wholesale purge of homosexuals from the State Department and other government agencies as McCarthy's vindicating legacy. With rare exceptions, however, neither new apologists for McCarthy nor those documenting the devastation he caused acknowledged the Lavender scare. While the historical literature about the McCarthy era focuses on the hunt for communists, and headline-grabbing cases such as those of Alger Hiss and Owen Lattimore, most of those fired as security risks were not those named by Senator McCarthy as communists. The typical case involved a homosexual confronted with circumstantial evidence that he had associated with known homosexuals or been arrested in a known gay cruising area. Almost all those accused quietly resigned rather than risk further publicity. The lack of attention in historical scholarship to the Lavender scare, as well as the lack of popular memory about it, cannot be attributed simply to a lack of concern for homosexuals. Methodological and interpretive problems have contributed to this oversight. Both the popular imagination and the historiography of 1950s witch hunting focus on the role of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Even gay people who lived in D.C. in the 1950s and watched the purges unfold attributed them to McCarthy, who was the first major politician to publicly suggest that there were homosexuals in the government and that they posed a risk to national security. His speeches often made passing references to communists and queers, and certainly the political climate of fear and accusation he spawned fed these purges. But McCarthy was not the principal backer of the homosexual purges. After his initial round of publicity in early 1950, he essentially dropped the subject of homosexuals in the State Department. As one political commentator remarked, when he started his probe, he didn't know about the homosexual angle. Now he's uncertain what to do about it. Despite pressure from other Republican leaders who felt that such charges were creating more of a stir, McCarthy was not involved in any of the congressional investigations or hearings into homosexuals in government. Though he was a member of the congressional committee that spent several months examining the homosexuals in government issue, McCarthy mysteriously recused himself from those hearings. The press suggested he did not want to be in the position of judging his own accusations. A knowledgeable observer at the time suggested that he did not pursue the homosexual angle more aggressively because he was afraid of a boomerang. As an unmarried, middle-aged man, he was subject to gossip and rumor about his own sexuality, so it fell to McCarthy's more senior colleagues, such as Senators Stiles Bridges, Kenneth Wherry, and Clyde Hoey, to press the issue more aggressively. Whatever the reason for his reticence, turning the spotlight on McCarthy tends, paradoxically, to keep the anti-gay purges in the shadows. To attribute the purges to McCarthy serves to marginalize them historically. It suggests that they were the product of a uniquely unscrupulous demagogue, did not enjoy widespread support, and were not part of mainstream conservatism or the Republican Party. Much of the scholarship on McCarthy uses his attacks on homosexuals as evidence of his incompetence and lack of focus. This was a favorite tactic of the few 1950s journalists critical of McCarthy's methods. According to one of the more in-depth critiques, when things were not going well for him in early 1950, McCarthy had an inspiration. Sex was the answer to all his problems. Not plain old-fashioned sex, of course, but homosexuality. If the facts about communists were missing, why not substitute fairy tales? A critically acclaimed 1959 biography referred to the bedlam quality of McCarthy's speeches and pondered, could anything but sheer lunacy lead a man discussing 81 communists to say that one of the communists was an important example because he was not a communist? As McCarthy explained during that speech, the non-communist was important precisely because he illustrated the rather unusual mental aberrations of State Department employees, aberrations that led to both sexual and political deviance. Historian Robert Griffith also used McCarthy's homosexual cases to discredit him, lumping them with cases where there was no evidence of misconduct, or ones which were skipped over, forgotten, or misnumbered. Although these commentators fault McCarthy for straying from the presumed central target of communists, several of McCarthy's fellow Republicans urged him at the time to focus more on homosexuals and other security risks, since they were more numerous and easier to uncover. For months during the Senate committee investigation into McCarthy's charges, a team of Republican leaders attempted to shift the focus from communists to homosexuals, but such efforts are mostly overlooked in the extensive literature on McCarthy and his tactics. The association of the anti-gay purges with McCarthy not only serves to marginalize them, but also suggests that they lasted only as long as McCarthy's tenure in the spotlight, from his Wheeling, West Virginia speech in February 1950 until his censure by the Senate in December 1954. It ignores how the purges predated McCarthy, became institutionalized within the federal loyalty/security system, and continued to be standard government policy until the 1970s. Republican members of Congress began to express concerns about homosexuals in the State Department in 1947, at the very onset of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. With the rise of McCarthy in 1950, their concerns became public and sparked a moral panic within both popular and political discourse. After several congressional investigations, the homosexuals in government issue largely fell out of the headlines because opposition to the anti-gay campaigns was so limited, and because no fired gay employee stood up and challenged his dismissal until 1957, the press lost interest. There were no dramatic confrontations between congressional committees and accused homosexuals, as there were with accused communists, to capture the nation's attention. Such encounters occurred not under the Klieg lights of a Capitol Hill hearing room, but in private, cramped, non-air-conditioned security interrogation rooms throughout Washington. While newsreels from the period capture members of Congress asking the famous question, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" Another question was posed at least as frequently, if more discreetly. "Information has come to the attention of the Civil Service Commission that you are a homosexual. What comment do you care to make?" Though newspaper coverage diminished, the purges continued. The lessening of publicity after 1950 is not a testament to the lack of anti-gay efforts, but to their routinization and institutionalization in the bureaucracy of the national security state. The euphemism, security risk. The lack of attention to the anti-gay campaigns by historians cannot be attributed to a lack of public discussion at the time. There is a common assumption that sexual issues were not discussed in newspapers and other popular media outlets in the 1950s. Even knowledgeable people who lived through the McCarthy era claim that they never saw mention of homosexuality in their newspapers, suggesting that the subject was still under wraps in those days. Though some media outlets were reticent to discuss the topic directly and took refuge in euphemism and innuendo, the 1950s generally witnessed a tremendous upsurge in publicity about sexual perverts. News coverage was particularly heavy in the spring of 1950 in the wake of the Purifoy revelation, when homosexuality first became a national political issue and members of Congress were calling for investigations. Although the Washington, D.C. papers carried the most extensive coverage of the Lavender scare, small-town newspapers carried it as well. When a Michigan congressman referred to homosexuals as the unmentionables, a colleague asked, "Oh, you mean the people that Dr. Miller has talked about so much on the floor of the House of Representatives?" "Yes," the congressman replied, complaining about the effect such publicity was having on his reputation among his constituents. When they begin to publish it in the newspapers, my folks want to know who I am associating with down here and how long they are going to keep those fellows on the payroll. The issue was so frequently discussed on the Senate and House floors that one congressman lamented, "I do not know what homosexuals are, but I never saw anybody get as much free advertising in the Congress of the United States in all my life." Columnist Robert C. Ruark considered the newspaper coverage so extensive as to constitute a watershed in the history of journalism. For the first time, he suggested, it is possible to face the problem of homosexuality and perversion with the same honesty it took us so long to win in the case of venereal disease. In July 1950, New York Post columnist Max Lerner published a 12-part series entitled Scandal in the State Department. It remains the most extensive treatment of the Lavender scare in print. Though reticence about sexual matters may have limited coverage in some situations, there is no dearth of materials from the 1950s detailing the issue of homosexuals in government. Although much newspaper coverage of the purges was explicit, some was cryptic, resorting to coded language that must be carefully interpreted by historians. One 1953 story from the Buffalo Evening News, for example, was devoted entirely to the perceived problem of homosexuals in the State Department, yet never used the words homosexual or sexual pervert, the favored terms in the 1950s for men and women attracted to members of their own sex. It referred instead only to men of unconventional morality whose habits make them especially vulnerable to blackmail. Citing Alfred Kinsey's studies, the article noted that men who have this weakness or exhibit these peculiarities constitute between 4 and 8% of the population. It even quoted testimony by a State Department undersecretary explaining to Congress why the Foreign Service was particularly attractive to such individuals, referring vaguely to morals problems. An informed reader in 1953, aware of the homosexual scandal in the department, would have known precisely what the article was about. Today, a reader unaware of this historical background might not be able to decipher its code. Often the explicitness of the homosexual references was determined less by the propriety or reticence of the publisher than by his political leanings. Conservative periodicals seeking to embarrass the Democratic administration delighted in raising the possibility that the federal civil service, which had ballooned during the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, was brimming with homosexuals. More liberal supporters of Truman often tried to downplay the Republican charges of perversion. This is most clear in the way in which the press covered Secretary of State Dean Acheson's defense of his department against Republican charges of both disloyalty and immorality in the ranks. In an often-quoted endorsement of his employees, Acheson characterized them as honorable, loyal, and clean-living American men and women. Practically every historical survey of the McCarthy period includes Acheson's defense of his staff, but none bothers to explain why he felt compelled to defend their morality as well as their loyalty. Although Acheson's comments clearly addressed charges of both political and sexual deviance, his language was vague enough to allow for interpretation. The capital's leading daily newspaper, the Washington Times-Herald, controlled by arch-conservative Robert R. McCormick of the Chicago Tribune, took the opportunity to remind its readers that the clean living reference apparently referred to charges the State Department is a hotbed of homosexuality. The more neutral New York Times provided context by citing Senator Carl E. Mundt's recollection about 91 employees discharged as homosexuals. The liberal allies of the administration focused on the loyalty portion of the statement. The Washington Daily News, for example, ignored Acheson's reference to morality and noted only that he rejected charges of communism in the State Department and was confident about the loyalty and qualifications of his associates. Like other Truman allies, such papers preferred not to call attention to the homosexual charges. Although each newspaper put an interpretive spin on Acheson's statement, either by highlighting how it addressed the homosexual charges or by ignoring them, the conservative press more accurately reflected the dual nature of the Secretary's defense and the close relationship in 1950s political culture between morality and loyalty. Much of the historiography of McCarthyism follows, wittingly or unwittingly, the more liberal stance of downplaying or ignoring the morality issue. The problem of vague language has complicated the issue of chronicling the Lavender Scare. When not referred to directly as homosexuals or sex perverts, such persons were often called moral weaklings, sexual misfits, moral risks, misfits, undesirables, or persons with unusual morals. But the most slippery and euphemistic term of all was security risk. Although many people at the time, and many historians since, assumed that a security risk was simply a lesser version of a communist, someone with communist sympathies but no outright party connections, in official circles, the two categories were quite distinct. Persons guilty of espionage or connections to allegedly subversive organizations like the Communist Party were guilty of disloyalty. Persons who might divulge secret information because they were either careless or coerced were labeled security risks. When defining the difference between a loyalty risk and a security risk, government officials typically explained that loyalty involved a current state of mind, a willful desire to betray secrets, while security involved behaviors or associations that might lead one inadvertently or unwillingly to betray secrets in the future. When pressed to give an example of a security risk, government officials typically mentioned those who talked or drank too freely or did both. As one government official explained, a chronic alcoholic, he may be perfectly loyal to the United States, but under the influence of liquor, will talk and reveal classified information. It was the example of an alcoholic that Secretary of State Dean Acheson raised when asked to define the term during the same hearing when his assistant revealed that 91 homosexuals had been dismissed. One congressional leader referred to the alcoholic as the classic Hollywood type of State Department story, whose weakness left him open to subversive infiltration. Despite the high profile given to alcoholism in public discourse surrounding security, few, if any, alcoholics were separated from the government as security risks. When questioned in 1951 by Congress, a State Department security officer responded, "I do not know of any cases that have been terminated as a security risk on account of alcoholism." By way of explanation, he added, "We have not had any real complaints of alcoholism that would warrant our investigating them." In the troika of sinners routinely listed as security risks, the alcoholic, the loquacious, and the pervert, only the pervert was always a security risk. The other two categories involved qualifications: not all those who talk, but those who talk too much; not all those who drink, but those who drink too much. But even one homosexual encounter qualified someone as a security risk, making it perhaps the easiest such offense to prove. It was the only one of the three to be illegal, thereby automatically enlisting every police force in the nation in its enforcement. It was the only one that warranted a full-scale congressional investigation, the only one requiring specialized security officers, the only category about which government departments kept specific records. In most statistics about security risks, homosexuals composed the single largest contingent. Although security risk covered a variety of offenses, it often functioned as a euphemism for homosexual. Even when used to describe alcoholics and the loquacious, the term security risk still invoked the specter of homosexuality. In 1950s public discourse, both alcoholism and loquaciousness were traits closely associated with same-sex desire. Government security officers routinely characterized homosexuals as so gregarious that they were unable to keep secrets. Their great desire to talk, officials asserted, meant they were quick to confess and name names. It was said that information passed through homosexual networks with astounding speed. Though persons who threatened security with their loose lips were not all homosexual, the two categories were thought to overlap. Even closer was the link between drinking and homosexual activity. Both psychiatric literature and popular fiction of the period portrayed the alcoholic as a repressed homosexual who acted on his same-sex desires only while intoxicated. Alcohol plays an important role in the problem of sexual deviations, Time magazine noted in April 1950, because it released repressed desires. If the psychiatric community already considered alcoholism a form of latent homosexuality, the connection was popularized by Charles Jackson's popular 1944 novel, The Lost Weekend, the basis for the film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1945. The novel tells the story of an upper-class New York alcoholic and repressed homosexual whose binge drinking one weekend propels him into a number of gay milieus. When recognized there as a fellow homosexual, the protagonist claims he is merely the potential confederate that was every alcoholic. As a term that invoked multiple dangers even in its official usage, and even more implications as used and misused by the general public, security risk was the ideal term for those who sought to portray the executive branch as riddled with subversives. Though it evoked danger, disloyalty, even espionage, it applied to a broad group of people considered potentially vulnerable to manipulation, homosexuals chief among them. A story from the December 1951 New York Times reveals how government officials often relied on coded language to mask how the security system targeted homosexuals. The story reported how the officials used lie detector tests when investigating employees for security but not loyalty. Persons who are indiscreet in talk about their work or in associations with disreputable people are subject to security charges, the newspaper explained. If the reader forged on, the newspaper revealed the meaning of the government's coded language. It was understood that the few cases referred to were persons suspected of sexual perversion. Unless pressured, government officials often hid behind the generic term security risk when they were really talking about homosexuals. By looking beyond McCarthy and behind the ambiguous term security risk, this study reveals that a Lavender scare, a fear that homosexuals posed a threat to national security and needed to be systematically removed from the federal government, permeated 1950s political culture. Originating as a partisan political weapon in the halls of Congress, it sparked a moral panic within mainstream American culture and became the basis for a federal government policy that lasted nearly 25 years and affected innumerable people's lives. Though based on the flimsiest of evidence, no gay American was ever blackmailed into revealing state secrets, it prompted congressional hearings, presidential executive orders, and executive agency security briefings. Fed by post-war fears that America was in a state of moral decline, dominated by a new class of powerful government bureaucrats and threatened by communism, the Lavender scare was used to justify a vast expansion of the national security state. Ironically, its very success in eliminating thousands of suspected homosexuals from the government would also lead to its undoing, as gay men and lesbians began to organize politically to challenge what they came to see as an unjust government policy. It would provide much of the inspiration for the early gay rights movement. New sources. Integrating political, cultural, and social history. This book draws on a wide variety of primary sources. To uncover the thinking of politicians and security agents behind the purges, it makes extensive use of government documents such as congressional hearings, executive department records, and court cases, many only recently declassified and opened to historians. The records of the most extensive congressional investigation into the employment of homosexuals in government were only released in 2000, after being closed to the public for 50 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?